Alexa, open BraveWords Radio.
Welcome back to BraveWords Radio. Brought to you by Vox Protocol, the global leader in voice app entertainment. BraveWords Radio is an awesome musical extension of BraveWords.com, where we have been waving the flag of hard rock and heavy metal around the world for over 30 years. Since you have been here before, we hope you enjoy BraveWords Radio.
But please welcome to Brave Words, Streaming for Vengeance, Mr. Ace Trump from the Siren Artist Management Company, bands like Saxon, Lizzy, and Uriah Heep, and the Louder with Ace podcast. Welcome to Streaming for Vengeance.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you're based in LA.
I am.
And we do have a Canadian connection. I would love to start there because you grew up in BC. I did not know that. I knew a lot of things, but I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was born in Vancouver, and I lived the first 33 years of my life throughout different places in Canada. And until one day I had an opportunity present itself that basically allowed me to move to Los Angeles and embrace the music industry. So I moved here.
And what year was that?
2000.
Okay.
In early part of 2000. And up until that point, I had been doing my own little website. It was called Blast Waves, where I had started that in the mid-90s when all of the labels were beginning to embrace this new thing called the internet. They all knew they had to be a part of it, but they had no idea what to do with it. And so I just wrote them all and I said, listen, if you want to send me your stuff, I'll review it. And that led to interviews, which then led to various other things. And 30 odd years later, here I am.
How did you find, because the wheels are turning in my, as I look at the gray for, I guess, about 60 days straight since summer ended, and just like doing that whole transition to get into the States and all the hoops you had to jump through, or was it an easy process?
It was not an easy process. It took years, as a matter of fact. But the interesting thing that about the immigration laws of the United States is the United States wants to be number one at everything, and they don't really care how they get to be number one. And there is a particular clause in the U.S. immigration that's called persons of extraordinary ability. So basically, they list this criteria of about 11 or something different things that if you can fulfill 7 or 8 of them, then they consider you to basically be in the top 5% of your particular vocation, and they want you to be an American at that point. And I managed to convince the government that I was just that, and so they gave me the elusive green card.
So why music? Going way back in time, why music? Why travel that path?
Music for me from a very early age has been a passion that like no other in my life. In fact, it has confounded me and confused me for my entire life how everybody I meet isn't as obsessed with music as I am. And it was for early on for me, living in a little town in the interior of Alberta called Medicine Hat was really where the genesis of my musical obsession happened. And it started basically with a next door neighbors we had. They had this elderly couple, and they had a young grandson who would come and visit them. And he one day came over and he said, "You must hear this." And he put on this record, and it was A Night at the Opera from Queen. And I just, from that moment, I was just launched. And through a weird little story, I managed to obtain a little bit of pocket money at one point, and I went running down to the local record store to go buy my own copy of A Night at the Opera. And when I walked into the store, I remember walking up to the rack with all the music, and there was this banner posted above the rack that depicted this city in flames with these four dynamic looking clowns dancing on the ruins. And I just sat there and I went, what is that? And the guy at the store said, well, that's the new album from a band called Kiss. It's called Destroyer. And I said, I don't know what that is, but I have to have it. And I bought it right then and there. And from the opening chords of Detroit Rock City, I knew that music was going to be a huge part of my life. So.
Now, before we dig deep into the Louder with Ace podcast, I love your photo, and I think one of the survival tactics, and I'd like to ask you what more are to survive in this industry, is a sense of humor and a smile. What do you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it's so boring to me when you see all these various official portraits of people and they've got that stern look, like, you know, we're going to beat you if we meet you in a dark alley or something. But to me, music in my life is all about the joy that it brings. I mean, music, it was always my goal to have a music library that could provide me with a soundtrack to whatever mood I was in. But definitely in my book anyway, music and joy are very much synonymous with each other.
So talk to me about the Louder with Ace podcast and all the problems you're trying to figure out in the music business. What's your mission statement?
Well, the podcast itself was born out of the pandemic. You know, when the pandemic really gripped the music industry, especially the live music industry, we were at our wits' end. We didn't know what to do. We literally went in January of 2020 from projecting the biggest year in our 20-year history as a management company to going within a few weeks to the worst year in our history. And so there was a long period of time there where basically there wasn't an awful lot for us to do. And I have a very dear friend here in Los Angeles who is a filmmaker who works at Manhattan Beach Studios. His name is Mark. And one day Mark invited me over to his studio. He said, look, you know, I know we're all social distancing, but my studio is 40 feet square, so we can be safely apart from each other and we can project a movie on the screen and just hang out. And he told me that during the pandemic, he had started doing podcasts for various companies. And he said, you know, you have so many great stories about all the bands that you played with over the years and that you worked with that, you know, people are always riveted by your stories. It would make fantastic podcast material. Well, you know, what else you got to do? Let's go have some fun with this. So we started this podcast. I have an assistant named Sean who was involved, and I have a rather possessive German Shepherd named Boomer who would always muscle in on the interviews. But we started tackling the topics that was interesting to us, but it was also people would come to me and all the time would ask me questions about when they'd hear that I was managing bands. They would say things like, you know, like, well, how do you become a band manager? Like, how does that happen? Or they didn't understand a lot of the most basic elements of what happens with the management of a band. Like, they didn't know what a producer was, as opposed to an agent, as opposed to a tour manager, as opposed to a band manager. So, and then the other thing that we got inundated with all the time after we started getting some success with our bands is artists would come to us and say, listen, how do we find success? How do we get signed to labels? How do we find agents? And that sort of thing. So we started doing podcasts about that and addressing those issues. So that began it. And then as the pandemic developed and as various world events started manifesting themselves and affecting this industry, whether it would be the pandemic or Brexit, which was a big one for us, or the invasion of the Ukraine, that we started realizing that the governments of the world really had no idea how to help this industry or even address it. There's so much misconception about people who are in the music industry. When you have a band like, say, Uriah Heep or Thin Lizzy or stuff, people assume that if you're in that band that you are wealthy beyond belief and that, you know, you've got no troubles in this world. But most classic rock bands these days are working musicians. They need to work in order to pay the mortgage and put food on the table. So we started talking to government and saying, what are you doing to help? And that's kind of what we've been doing as of late.
Well, I'll be honest with you, I've been doing this for well over 30 years. And just to play a little bit of devil's advocate, it's always been the Wild West. It's always had a really nasty hello from the gutter reputation, right? So I've never actually, BraveWords has never actually gotten any help from any government. And during COVID, holy shit, with all the venues and all the bands, it was like we were way down the ladder in terms of any kind of government funding, big time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it was hard for us because we had the members of the bands that we represent coming to us and saying, what are we going to do? And not only the bands, but even to a larger degree, the support staff that go out with the bands, the
Right.
roadies and things like that. Those guys were really screwed out of this whole thing. And in fact, we are now seeing people, there seems to be this whole mentality that the pandemic is over and that, we're now pretty much back to normal. But we are actually still feeling tremendous amounts of the after effects of that. Like, we are now seeing promoters going bankrupt because they've had 2 years of no income and they can't deal with what's happening now. We lost 3 in the last few months that affected us quite heavily. And also during the course of the pandemic, a large number of the roadies who were easily called on to go do tours, they had to find employment in other avenues.
Right.
And now they're not part of the industry anymore. So finding qualified staff to take bands out on tour is a challenge. And then, you realize, especially in Europe, how much of the synergy between the different countries cooperating with each other allowed things in the music industry to work, whether it be Brexit now causing issues with things like merchandise and work permits and carnets and all those wonderful things, down to the fact that Russia supplied a lot of the fuel to the rest of Europe, and when we cut that off with the sanctions, the cost of touring has gone up tremendously, 2-3 times sometimes what it used to cost. So much so that you're noticing that there are a lot of bands now who are just waving the white flag and saying, look, until things improve, we just can't tour. So that's just the reality of where we're at. And of course, we can't really pass the cost on to the consumer.
No.
If somebody came along and was paying, I don't know, $50 to see a band just before the pandemic, you can't go and say, well, it's $200 now. So
yeah,
not going to happen.
Well, I can't imagine during those years during COVID to actually have a stable of bands that you're supposed to be taking care of. And I don't know how you would have managed that situation.
It was difficult. I mean, we tried to do the very best that we could. Several of our artists decided to utilize that time by recording new albums. Some of them embraced virtual avenues, like especially a guy like Ricky Warwick from Thin Lizzy, the lead singer. He started doing these monthly online concerts that would sell out every time. And, so we were finding our way. But, what we're experiencing now, which a lot of people don't appreciate, is that the incredible glut of live material that is now clogging the touring avenues. You are basically getting all the bands who wanted to tour in 2020, 2021, and 2022, plus the bands that are planning to go in 2023 to begin with. And they're all trying to fill the venues, and there's just not enough concert dollar out there to support everybody who wants to go out and play. So it's an ongoing problem we're dealing with, and yeah, so hopefully we'll see something happen. And then on top of that, of course, with the glut of material going into the venues, there were a number of venues who relied on concerts coming into their venues during the pandemic that didn't have an income for 2 years, and they went out of business. So there's less venues as well. So
Right.
It's a perfect storm of nightmare for as far as organizing live shows.
No, I hear you. 2022 was really bizarre because we went from every band on the planet, as you just stated, doing nothing, to everybody either releasing a record or going out on the road or doing both all at the same time. I've never seen such a parade of bands coming through Toronto. We're not one of the biggest, like, we're a big tour city, but My gosh, it was just hard to keep up with. And you're right, 2023 is just gonna, that tsunami wave is just gonna continue to pound us.
Yeah, and you know, another factor that a lot of people don't appreciate is that we are not over the pandemic yet. COVID-19 is still wreaking havoc in the concert industry. And you know, speaking more from the logistics side of things, when a band goes on tour, most people don't understand that the first 80 or 85% of the shows you're doing on the tour are generating the income in order to pay for the whole tour. You know, all the flights, the visas, the carnets, the wages, the hotels, the buses, the airplanes, all that. And it's only when you get to like the last 15% or so of the shows that the band's starting to make some profit. But with COVID-19, you know, a band member gets sick, suddenly a week of shows is wiped out, and suddenly the tour goes from profit to break even or worse. And so it's an ongoing problem, and we're not over it yet. And I wish we would stop acting like we were. So
right. No, I hear you. I hear you. So what's the fix then, aside from trying to fix the whole concert scenario? What are other fixes that bands can utilize?
Unfortunately, that is a question that has been running through our collective minds on as far as the people who work at Siren for the last coming up on 3 years, and we haven't come up with anything yet. The reality is you can't force people to follow mask mandates and vaccination schedules. In fact, I know so many people who are faking it in this industry, or if they get sick, they lie about it and they go ahead and do the shows anyway. And it's just we have now come to a place where we have to just live with COVID-19 as part of our everyday function, and that we just need to find a way to deal with it. It is here to stay, and there really is no solution to it at the moment.
So here's a left field question for you. People like Merck trying to save the industry with his business model of selling catalog. Yeah, you've got some heritage bands that have a lot of catalog worth. Is that being discussed in your world?
Oh, certainly. Some of my bands have made deals like that. Some of them we're in discussions with. I mean, I've studied it quite a bit myself. I've actually done episodes of my podcast about this very topic, because it is something that I think a lot of people don't really appreciate. And again, it comes back to that idea of understanding how this industry works and what exactly music publishing is. And you know, you hear these monumental deals being made, like Springsteen getting $500 million for his catalog, and people in Fleetwood Mac making hundreds of millions and stuff.
Right.
And, you know, to me, it is very much a case of, it's not like this in Canada, you know, with the lotteries, but down here in the States, when you win a big lottery on one of the big tickets here, you have your choice to either take it over 20 years in equal installments or to take half of it right now.
Right.
And that kind of is exactly how I look at the publishing kind of thing. If you have a catalog that is generating money, it will generate money for years and years to come. But on the other hand, somebody can come to you and say, well, right now you can have this massive amount of cash and just let us deal with the catalog and make our money back. And to a lot of artists, that's quite appealing, because they're either at the point in their life where they want to reap the benefits of their work, or they want to establish a legacy for their inheritance, you know, for their children and for their loved ones and things like that. So there's and you also can't underestimate the fact that an organization like Hypnosis or Roundtree or any of the other big ones, if they're controlling the catalog, they have a vested interest in making sure that that catalog is exploited to its maximum. So you start getting people hearing your music more and more. I mean, like from a personal point of view, a few years ago, we were approached by a big American insurance company called Geico that were doing a series of ads involving artists. And they approached us about an idea for the band Europe. And Europe, they wanted to use this thing with the final countdown. And it became such a big hit as far as advertising goes, that it drove the song back to it actually drove it to #1 for 3 weeks in the Billboard charts. It had never been #1 before, even at its height in the 80s.
Right.
So, there's a lot of advantage to that sort of thing.
And it probably helped push it over 1 billion views on YouTube.
Absolutely.
Right. Do you ever think growing up as a collector of CDs, and then it went to streaming, and now this whole LP thing, it's been a really weird ride the last 10, 15 years. What do you think?
Yeah, I tell you, when I first was into music, LPs were the way. I can even date myself back to 8 tracks. Okay, I had 8 tracks when I was starting out. And then the whole cassette revolution, and of course when CDs came into play, that was a big deal for us. But CDs, in my point of view, were always a compromise, because the thing that people like me who were big into music, they loved having those 12-inch square cardboard depictions of the artwork, so you could read all the credits easily, and that was always something that bummed me out when CDs started manifesting all through the market, was that you lost that. I mean, at the beginning of CDs, you had the long boxes, which kind of tried to do that, but that went away very, very quickly. And so when vinyl started coming back, and I'm not one of those people who sits there going, oh, I listen to vinyl because it sounds so much better and everything. Screw that. Give me the MP3, whatever, give me the streaming service, that's fine with me. But for me, it's all about the artwork. And artwork on albums has always been a very big deal to me. I mean, guys like the guys who did the Pink Floyd stuff or did the Rush albums, Storm Thurgeson and people like that. And even I've become friends with someone like Johannes, who's done some of the famous album covers for various bands that I love. He and I become friends, and he has a lot of insight into that sort of thing. So that's what I love about the vinyl thing. The downside, and this is just my opinion, you can tell me if you've noticed this, that the quality of the vinyl pressings has deteriorated tremendously. And I think that we don't hear about that more, because I don't think people buy the albums to listen to. I think they buy them just because they look cool.
And I'm on the same page as you. It's most of my vinyl does not get opened. It's just part of being a collector. Let's talk about you and collecting.
Why?
I don't even know where to begin, because I've been collecting since the early 70s. And yes, I still have a bunch of long boxes. I could go into what's your favorite? What's your holy grail? What's your prized possession? Plural.
Well, for me, it has always been a thing about myself that when I find an artist that I really, really like, I tend to go super deep into them. I explore their entire catalogs. I find out what their influences were and what's going on. And there have been a few of them along the way that still stand in my hall of fame of bands that I love to this day. And a few of them who I am a massive collector of. You can kind of see behind me one of the biggest ones, and that's this band called The Residents that I first got into in the late 80s. And I have a formidable collection of Residents material and some very rare material. And in fact, you can't see it, but right here on my wall is a sculpture that was featured on one of their album covers. I have the actual sculpture here on my wall and things like that. So the Residents were a big one for me. I tend to collect certain things, like, for example, in 1981, one of the albums that affected me tremendously was the soundtrack to the animated film Heavy Metal. That soundtrack to this day still is one of the foundations of my musical taste. There were so many bands that I grew to love out of that album, and consequently the movie as well. So I have considerable amount of collectibles where I've collected original cells and original backgrounds from that film and various things which populate my home. But You know, my home is basically a tribute to my collecting fanaticism. I remember my nephew, the first time he came into my house, he stood in the middle of my media room and he just did a slow 360-degree circle looking around. He goes, "Wow, you have the most decorated house in the world."
Well,
But
it's not just music. I had a really touching chat with Tom G. Warrior from Celtic Frost a couple of weeks ago because of the whole Danse Macabre box set, and he was really good friends with H.R. Giger. And To Megatherion is arguably one of the greatest heavy metal album covers of all time. And yeah, it was a pretty somber moment talking about his relationship. And you've collected a few of his pieces of artwork, I understand.
yes, he is one of my all-time favorite artists. I think that I've watched many documentaries about him. He's a genius among artists, and I think that, you know, when you learn about his motivation for painting and why those images come out of him, it's an incredibly powerful thing. The only downside to collecting him is that very little of his material was ever made available to the public. So when you do stumble upon some of HR's stuff available for sale, it goes for astronomical amounts of money because there are so many people who love his stuff. Now, the one thing I'm super excited about is in a few months here in Los Angeles, they have a special what would you call it, display, I guess, devoted to him, and they've got the biggest collection of his original art that they've ever assembled in one place ever, and his sculptures and his paintings and various things, and it's going to be amazing. I can't wait till that opens to the public. So
now you've got such an incredible stable of bands. Talk to me about some of your favorite moments, your highlights, your lowlights. Who's your favorite to deal with?
Well,
there's a lot of that's a tough question. I realize that.
You're gonna get me in trouble here.
Yeah.
You know, the thing with my business partner Adam and I is that we have some very basic rules about any of the artists that we represent. And the first one is we do not represent any band whose music we don't adore, because we just don't think that we can adequately represent somebody whose music doesn't mean a great deal to us.
Right.
And that's been a difficult you know, milestone to maintain, because sometimes you get approached by artists who, you know, you could make a tremendous amount of money off of, but you don't really believe in what their music is all about and everything. And so we've reluctantly said no. But the thing that excites me is the fact that I look back in the, you know, in the early 80s or late 70s when I was first getting big into music, and I was sitting in my parents' basement looking at, you know, the credits on those albums and reading the lyrics and discovering all this music. Now to be sitting here 30, 40 years later and being involved and responsible for those artists' careers and where they're going with now and helping shape the future of their music is so beyond surreal to me. The fact that I'm in this role, that I just think I'm one of the luckiest people in the world.
No, I hear you. You also don't want to be a used car salesman, right?
Right. And but it's more than that. You know, here is a position that is, for me, is very, very filled with responsibility, in that these artists who I grew up and who helped form my musical taste are now turning to me for my advice on what they should do next. Like, I'm actively involved in the future of an artist. You know, like you take Uriah Heep, we're about to put a new album out next month, like their 25th record or something like that. And I know that through the trials and tribulations over the last couple of years of us making this, that album would be a very different beast if it wasn't for my involvement. And at this stage, I remember a few months ago, my assistant kind of dropped a bomb on me, and he said, "Do you know that you have been involved in one way or another in about 62 albums at this point in your career?" And I sat back and I just went, "Wow, that's just staggering to me." I mean, working with, you know, I know you're a major fan of Motorhead, and I worked with them for 25 years, and being in a position where, you know, Lemmy calls you over to his house and starts playing you the record because he wants your opinion on whether or not it's good enough. I mean, who am I? You know? So
well, and at the same time, you're getting paid to do it, right?
I am.
Like, this is my job. It's like I'd be doing this for free, but
well, you know, one of the biggest things for me is that I really love being close to that flame of the creation of the music. To me, the music that my artists have created over the years has meant so much to me. The fact that I really love the fact that I get to know these people as human beings and get to kind of delve into what makes the whole machine tick. And also because I get to hear all those stories that you don't always get to hear because you're around them all the time. The fact that, you know, Scott Gorham from Thin Lizzy, you know, we're about to start a tour and he decides he wants to go to Amsterdam for a few days before to kind of get into the touring mode. And he says, oh, but I don't want to go alone. Hey, Ace, why don't you come with me to Amsterdam for a few days and we'll just hang out? You know, like, what? Okay, I'm down.
but in your travels, just a couple more quickies for you, some fun questions. Are artists that you were just like jaw dropping in awe that you were actually standing in front of this person, like
well,
the Elvis Presley moment or something?
You know, I've had a few experiences where, you know, one little game that somebody once asked me is, who's the most famous person you've ever met, or a famous musician? And I thought about some of the stories that had happened to me. Like one time, there's a magazine in England called Mojo, which is a music magazine, and every year they have an annual awards thing. And on this particular year, this was, I don't know, maybe 7-8 years ago, Motorhead was getting a Lifetime Achievement Award at this ceremony.
Right.
And as part of the whole thing, it was held in London, and we had just finished a bunch of festivals. I'd been out on the road with Motorhead, and we'd done a bunch of festivals. And so we were in London, and we had a whole table at this festival. And so the management called me and said, hey, do you want to go? You know, there's extra room at the table if you want to go to the Mojo Awards. And I was like, hell yeah, I'll go to the Mojo Awards. And so Mickey, Lemmy, and I went, and we were sitting at this table. And I remember at one point, Jimmy Page walked over and to say hi to Lemmy, you know, and he sits down at the table and they're chatting away. And all of a sudden he says, oh, you know, Jimmy says, oh, Lemmy, we got to stay in touch, you know. He says, oh, yeah, let's exchange numbers. And I watched these two icons trying to program each other's numbers into their cells. And finally, Lemmy just stopped, and he turned and he handed me both their phones and said, can you please program our numbers into our phones? And I'm sitting there going, I'm programming Jimmy Page's phone. Okay, yeah.
That's awesome.
But probably the coolest one I ever had was growing up. One of the bands, especially being Canadian, that meant so much to me was Rush. They're one of my favorite bands of all time. And I was out on the road with Black Star Riders, and we were playing this amazing festival in Sweden called Sweden Rock. And the headliner on our day was Rush. They had never done a festival here before. And now, back in the 70s, Rush and Thin Lizzy toured together a lot, and Scott Gorham had become very good friends with Alex Lifeson. And one of the things about Sweden Rock is that they hire this incredible chef to do the catering for the bands, so nobody misses the food at Sweden Rock because it's always so good. And so I had an interview that Scott was going to be doing live on Swedish radio in about an hour. So I said, well, if you want to get your dinner in before the interview, maybe we should go have our dinner now. So we went into this thing, and sitting at the table next to us was the entire Rush crew. Now, a lot of those guys had been there for many, many years, and they knew Scott, and they came over and said hi and everything. And Alex's tech was there, and he said, oh, if Alex knew you were here, he'd want to say hi. And he says, well, we're having dinner, you know, go give him a call. And a few minutes later, I was sitting there talking to Scott, and Scott suddenly stopped me. He says, "Get up." I went, "What?" He says, "Move a chair over. Just get up." And I went, "Okay." So I got up and I left the chair between us, and all of a sudden I looked up and it's Alex Lifeson, right? And he goes, "Oh, Scott, how's it going?" And he says, and Scott invites him to sit down between us, and he goes, "Oh, Alex, this is my manager, Ace. He's a big fan of yours and everything." And I got to sit there for an hour and talk to my hero about this whole thing. And just when I thought it couldn't get any better, I suddenly my phone alarm went off, reminding me I had to get Scott to his live radio interview. And I said, "Alex, I can't believe I'm saying this, but we've got to go." and he turned to Scott and he said, "Oh, you're going to come watch us play, right?" And Scott went, I'm not really into that whole crowd thing and all of that. He says, "Oh, pish posh, you come on the side of the stage and watch." Amazing. And I swear to you, the entire table of roadies stopped in mid spoonful going to their mouths and turned and looked and went, "What?" And I didn't know what was going on. So I started to leave and I went to his tech and I said, "Is there anything wrong?" He goes, "Dude, I've been teching for that man for about 25 years. I think twice in the history of the band, people have been allowed to go on the side of the stage." And so Damon Johnson, Scott Gorham, and we went up at the time, and we got to watch the whole show standing 5 feet from Getty, or we went around to the other side to Alex's, and it was surreal. Alex would be out there playing, and it was on the Clockwork Angels tour with it. Every few songs they would have a little clip from a movie they had put together. And so there would be a little kind of break for the musicians, and Alex would come over, and he'd just been, playing Limelight or whatever, and he'd come over and he'd say, "Oh, do you still play golf? How's the wife?" It was those kind of moments that I just pinch myself and I go, I'm really lucky that I get to do this sort of thing. So
that's unbelievable. Are you much of an autograph guy?
I was before I got into the industry, but once I got into it, I realized that it was much more important to me to get to know these guys rather than to have something signed by them, or if I'm going to do something like that, I'd rather have a photograph with them rather than an autograph. But
what do you think about the punk rock museum that just opened up in Las Vegas? And we need a metal museum.
I think we do. I mean, there are little things like that all over the place. Like in Vegas, they now have the Kiss Museum. I haven't been to see it yet, but I hear good things.
And Metal Blade, Brian opened up his museum this year too.
And I know in Germany, I haven't seen this one yet either, but there's a fellow who do you know EMP Mail Order?
Yep, I do.
The guy who owns that has bought this bar/museum that he's building, that he's put his whole collection in. And he has come to me several times wanting to buy instruments from my artists, but he is very specific wants. Like he wants the actual instruments that the guys played on stage and have photographic proof of that. And
right.
But he has a lot of money to play with. So I mean, there are fun things like that you can find, but you're right. And certainly I'm not waiting with bated breath for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to get their act together, because that place is just a joke. So
Louder with Ace podcast. What is the loudest show you've ever witnessed?
Motorhead. I mean, Motorhead without a doubt. In fact, I can tell you which Motorhead show. We did a show in Bakersfield. This was, I think, on the Hammered tour. And it was staged in what was a arena that, well, not an arena, but a facility that was built for boxing matches. And this thing was essentially a concrete dome. And so when Motorhead went in there with all of their marshals cranked, the sound was reverberating off these concrete walls to such a degree that my hearing literally just went boo, and I had to go outside and listen to the concert from outside because it was making me dizzy with the audio assault that I was under at that show.
Wow. That's awesome. Ace, thank you so much for the conversation. I really appreciate it. It's such a wonderful moment to actually meet you in person. Too bad this is not at a pub or something.
It can be sometime in the future.
Yes, absolutely. All the best to you, okay?
Thank you so much for having me. I always wanted to finally get to talk to you, and keep up the excellent work with Brave Words and Bloody Knives.